Again, continuity and change over time. We're going to continue to see the negative effects of the Columbian Exchange and old imperialism on the New World. So these cultural and social changes are mostly going to be negative for the Native Americans. In terms of culture, aspects of culture can include religion, it can include written works, it can include language, food, clothing, traditions. Almost all of that is going to be completely wiped out by the Europeans. In addition to a literal death from exploration, the Native Americans are also going to suffer cultural death. Okay, because remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese and the conquistadors were Catholic. How Catholic? Super Catholic. And the Native Americans weren't, which, I mean, it's like, it's not their fault. Like, they'd never heard of this Jesus guy. But then the Europeans show up and they say, love Jesus or die. And so they get rid of what they consider heresy. Heresy is a crime against God, going against God's teachings. And what is the punishment for heresy? Death. Even in Europe, they're going to kill other Christians because they're the wrong kind of Christians. So the whole issue the Catholics have with the Protestants and the Muslims and the Jews is that they don't follow their rules, they don't follow the Pope. And so that's going to lead to almost 100 years worth of wars in Europe over religion, as well as the Reconquista, right? So they're definitely not going to look fondly upon or look kindly upon, say, human sacrifice or a polytheism or a sun god, right? So the Spanish and the Portuguese come in and they're like, yeah, no, we got to get rid of all of this heresy. They figured they were doing the Native Americans a favor by converting them and saving their eternal souls. They're like, oh yeah, okay, there's slavery, but think about the afterlife. Well, okay, still pretty negative. And so with that, they're going to destroy a lot of the literature and the history of the Native American peoples that they exploit. This is also going to change their social structures. Whereas prior to the Columbian Exchange, the population was entirely native, and you had Native Americans at the top, middle, bottom throughout the entire hierarchy. The great son, the great speaker, merchants, warriors, human sacrifices. Change over time. We're going to see the development of the casta system, peninsulares, Creoles, mestizos, mulattoes, zombos, indigenous peoples, Africans. So they're no longer at the top of society. That's delegated to the Europeans in the casta system. Also, we don't have a lot of primary sources from the natives about after colonization or like during colonization, not because they weren't educated enough to read or write. I mean, obviously they could. They had their own language and their own written form of Mayan glyphs, right? But one of the very few surviving examples of primary sources of the indigenous languages is the Florentine Codex. So that's where we're able to use it as a codex. We're able to use it to decode some of the surviving texts that we have from those once mighty empires. Okay, but most of those works are going to be literally lit on fire by the Europeans as they come through and they try to eliminate everything that they consider heretical. So even during colonization, we don't have a lot of sources written by the Native Americans as firsthand accounts. Instead, the Spanish conquistadors and the priests like Bartholomew de las Casas are going to write down what happened. Now, obviously, there's going to be a bias in that. Clearly, they're going to write in such a way that they are appealing to an audience or they are seeing things through their perspective. And you don't really have the perspective of the Native Americans or the Africans added to that historical record. Now, that doesn't mean that the Spanish conquistadors and priests are all going to write, complete lies. I mean, they're obviously going to have a bias towards wanting to make their mother country look good. But you do have some people like Bartholomew de las Casas, who wrote an account of the destruction of the Indies, where he's going to give us some insight into the genocide that was going on during exploration under the Spanish. Although, unfortunately for the Catholics, the Protestants are going to use that as anti-Catholic propaganda. Additional cultural and social changes. As the Catholic Church sends more Christian missionaries trying to convert the Inca and Aztec and other natives to the Christian religion, we're going to see again cultural syncretism, meaning that you take different aspects of two different cultures and you combine them together to make something new. Now, when the Spanish missionaries were coming over and telling them all about Jesus, Joseph, and the Virgin Mary, right? Sometimes they would bring over some art. Remember, this is after the Renaissance. And during the Renaissance, they were painting all sorts of religious paintings and figures and statues. Remember, because Catholics love icons. They are pro-icon. Eastern Orthodox, anti-icon. Muslims, they don't use icons of holy figures or images of holy figures, right? The Catholics, though, they are all about icons. So they're bringing a bunch of those icons over to the New World. But here's the thing. When they depict Jesus and the Mother Mary, the Madonna, and Joseph, or God even in their paintings, they look a lot like the Europeans. Well, the Native Americans and also the Africans in the New World are instead going to synchronize that information to better reflect their faith. So in the indigenous religions, there was a concept of a mother god. And so they're like, okay, mother god, and then Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. We're just going to kind of combine those two. The Virgin of Guadalupe traces back to a vision that a native claimed to have had where the Virgin Mary came down from heaven and spoke with him. And so when she appeared, she looked more like the natives. She did not look European, which makes sense considering, the birthplace of Jesus was the Middle East, and he and Joseph and Mary spent his formative years in Egypt. And then also with the diffusion of African culture into the New World, we know that it was primarily Islam that came from Africa, but then you also have the Bantu mystical animistic religions that have like a lot of magical shamanistic aspects to it. Well, that African aspect of religion is going to combine with Christianity to create Vodun, which you may have heard colloquially called voodoo. That's going to be in Haiti. So we have an example of religious syncretism with Africa and the New World, with the creation of Vodun, Christianity plus the animistic religions of the Western Africans. We have an example with the Native Americans combining their concept of a mother god with the Virgin Mary, and then also just the depictions of the holy figures to reflect the population that believes in them. The Europeans paint their holy figures as white. The Africans paint their holy figures as black. The Native Americans paint their holy figures as, looking like them as indigenous. Other social change, the social hierarchy. At the top, the Peninsulares, they came from the Iberian Peninsula. What two countries are on the Iberian Peninsula? Two countries in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. Spain and Portugal, perfect, okay? So the Peninsulares are Europeans, and they have the most power out of anybody in this hierarchy, even though their children, the Creoles, are Europeans born in the New World, and thus are Caucasian. The Creoles are not going to have as much power as the Peninsulares, and that's actually going to tick the Creoles off a lot. So they're going to host revolutions and declare independence, but that's going to be later in period 3. We'll get to that eventually. Creole is also a language. It's a syncretic language of African languages plus European languages. So in Louisiana, Creole is spoken a lot. In Haiti, Creole is spoken a lot. So there's two different definitions for Creole. Okay, they're both nouns. One refers to a group of people born in the New World who are European, and the other meaning for Creole means a language, a combination of European language and African language. With castas just means the mixed races. Okay, what heritage are the mestizos? What races are they descended from? Remember, we have 3 in the New World now: the Europeans, the Africans, and the Native Americans. Good, you have the Europeans and the Native Americans. Okay, what about the mulattoes? Spanish and African, good. What about zombos? African and Native American, good, TJ. And that ends the castas, that ends the mixed races. Then at the bottom, you have the Native Americans, the indigenous, and the enslaved peoples kidnapped from Africa. This is a big change over time, but then eventually it becomes a continuity. So if you're talking about from period 1 to period 2, this is a change over time. You go from all indigenous to 3 different races. But then as you go from period 2 to period 3 and period 4, this racial system is a continuity. That even today, there is racial discrimination in South America and in Mexico based on race. So that's something that we can see as an unfortunate continuity into the modern age. Final slide. Another long-term impact on the New World. Okay, again, yet another negative impact, was the environmental impact. We talked about the social, we talked about the cultural, we talked about the political, we talked about the demographic. Now let's look at the environmental effect. One, deforestation, getting rid of the trees. Why were they getting rid of the trees? Because they wanted fields to grow crops. So they would burn the trees and they would use the ashes to replenish the soil. But the issue with burning the trees, in addition to, pollution, is that it destroys those root systems holding the soil in place. So as a result of deforestation, you get soil depletion and erosion. Because they're growing so many cash crops, and those cash crops need a ton of water, that means it's going to drain their clean water resources, meaning that there's less clean water for the population. Instead, it's being used in order to grow these cash crops to maximize the profit for the mother country under mercantilism. So the Europeans weren't concerned with maintaining the community or maintaining these resources for future generations. It was more like, it's my money and I want it now sort of mentality. Let's say, oh yeah, there's all this land, there's always going to be more land and more territory, so who cares what we do with this? Burn it all down, grow cash crops. Once we destroy the soil, we just go find new soil and keep taking more territory in order to fund our mercantilist policies. Okay, so again, mostly negative effects for the Americas, not just the people living there, but like the literal territory.